Lisa has pretty much made my first slide redundant, where I'm sure all of you know what is MS and what's happening in the MS. The main abnormality in MS is the primary damage to the myelin in the central nervous system. So what you're seeing here is actually a brain from an MS patient, where you see the dark blue, which basically is staining that will label all the myelin in the brain. And what happened in the brain is where you see these white regions, which pretty much indicates the loss of myelin in the brain. So obviously this MS is a devastating disease, and we know it affects your motor and sensory disabilities. From what I'm interested in, which is the recent increasing awareness, that is, patients with MS usually display a high degree of comorbidity with psychiatric symptoms. So studies from hospital-based clinics reveal that about 20 to 50% of MS patients develop a major course of depression over the course of their life. And this is a figure that is 2 to 5 times higher than the general population. So we highlighted a few researchers that actually based in Australia, varies in different regions, to look at the comorbidity of MS and depression. And actually one of them was actually based on data conducted in the hospital that we're staying. So despite the fact that there are different populations, because there's still, starting area of research, despite the population that's involved in, and there are different criteria in terms of diagnosis of MS and diagnosis of depression, it has been pretty in the range that there were about 20 to 60% of the patients will have a course of depression over the course of their life. It has been estimated that the lifetime risk for depression in patients with MS is greater than 50%. And if you look at the numbers that are people suffering from other type of chronic disease, then will co-develop depression. And MS is definitely on the higher end of this figure. It's definitely high. It's certainly higher than people with Alzheimer's or even than cancer, and actually in the range for people with suffering from neurological disorders. So my point have been, we know that MS is a very effective disease in terms of motor disability, but how come changes in the myelin in the brain will actually change the psychiatric stage of the brain? And there's something that we have missing about the myelin, what does it do in the brain, so that we can have a better look and to design what's happening. So before that, I have to introduce the players. So what do we know about myelin? So the basic function and the traditional view of function, and if you're going to college and the textbook view of function, is that myelin is this insulating layer that's wrapped around the nerve signal, the nerve fibers, so that it speeds up the nerve conduction and help the information processing. And in the central nervous system, what you're looking here is this axon, which is the nerve fiber, is wrapped by the myelin. And the central nervous system, the only cell that will form or produce myelin is this cell called oligodendrocyte. And so what we do know about myelin is that it forms this insulating layer that will speed up conduction. But is that it? Is that's the only function of myelin? Or is that the only function of oligodendrocyte? It's just to produce this insulating layer and sitting in the fibers and doing nothing about it. And one recent study, and actually a few recent studies, have provided that on top of the function of forming myelin, oligodendrocytes have actually other functions. And one of them is, if you think about it, in the brain, a nerve signal has to carry it from one region of the brain to the other side of the brain. And the nerve fiber is actually quite long. And in order for the electrical signals to be carried over from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain, this is actually a quite energy demanding process. And where does this energy come from? And this nerve fiber is usually wrapped thickly by the myelin. Therefore, it's not able to get free energy, or at least it's not able to get energy easily from the outside environment. And studies have revealed that the oligodendrocytes, other than providing myelin, because they're the closest contact to the axons, to the nerve fibers, they actually produce trophic support and metabolic support to the axons. And therefore, you can imply if you have a problem, not only the myelin, but also the cell itself will have an impact on the way that the brain communicates between different regions, and therefore affecting the way the nerve signal is conducted from one side of the brain to the other. So the second point is, if you look at the development of a human myelination process, unlike other type of neurodevelopment processes, which usually finished at prenatal stages as well as first year, myelination, although initiated in the prenatal stages, and a lot of them were going on in the first year of human life, it actually continues into adult life, even into the second or the third decade of life. So again, if myelin is just an insulating layer that's sitting there to help the transduction of the nerve fibers, why doesn't it just finish when the neurodevelopment finishes? And why does it have to continue into adult life? And one hypothetical model we have proposed is that myelination is actually an adaptive response to the environment. And although we still don't know what that signal is, but this existing myelination can be modified by some kind of signal, then it will lead to, for example, you will have unmyelinated fibers responded to the signal and form new myelin, or it can intercalate or adding new segments to between the existing myelin sheaths, between the myelin nodes on the nerve, or it can just simply thickening the existing myelin. It doesn't take too hard to interpret that this changes in the myelin sheaths in any of this area could have an impact on the way that brain communicate between different regions, therefore will affecting the cognitive and psychiatric symptoms in the brain. And as a matter of fact, we have a little hint of what that signal might be. It's from evidence from experience-dependent myelination. So studies have been shown that children, or at least in the teenager age, from imaging studies showing that the myelination is actually affected by different regions, and this myelination is actually correlated with your reading skills and how you read, how you memorize things, and how you, say, perform piano. And actually, early experience or early enrichment experience in the human infants has shown that it increased the white matter structure as well as in parallel with improved the performance later on in your adult life with behavior tests. And conversely, children who are suffering severe childhood neglect have reduced volume in the brain white matter. And perhaps the best example to show that experience does affect myelination is from these Romanian children. So in late 1990s, and the Romanian dictator Ceausescu has carried out this policy for augmenting the Romanian population by providing scholarships to mothers who have more than one children and prohibiting contraception or adoption. So he did augmenting the population, but he also resulted in a lot of these children who were born at the same period being raised up in an orphanage in an adverse environment. And these children often later on suffer psychiatric disorders such as ADHD. And recently, people have started looking at the brain of these children from imaging studies and shown that these children have actually changed brain volume, including both gray matter and white matter. And particularly, they have less myelination in their brain. So what this suggests is clearly 2 points. The first one is myelination is response to the experience at the very minimum at infant stage or teenager stage. And second of all, these children, although later on they were adopted to a lovely family with adopted parents, but their symptoms do not recover. So what this suggests is that it's not only experience, but also the quality of the experience that matters to the brain. So is that it? So for sure we know that at earlier stage, myelination is responsible, and they are very plastic and adapted, are able to adapt to environmental stimuli. What about adult? We're all adult. Do we just, once we grow up, do we just lose this ability to adapt, or does the myelination in the adult brain just lose the adaptability to adapt? So as a young scientist, I start out to just ask a simple question, which is adult myelination affected by experience? And by experience, I'm particularly interested in the stressful experience, because stress is a very high risk factor for developing depression. And how does this stressful experience is affecting the brain, specifically in the adult brain? So in the lab, we work with animals, and the animals I'm working with are mice. And to understand how does the experience affect adult myelination, we want to create mouse models and understand how does experience affect the brain of the brain myelination. And the experience I use is called social isolation. So what I do is I took adult mouse, so they're already fully grown, and just simply place them in different environments. One is their regular housing environment. They like to mingle with each other, and you put them together, they all love each other. And the other type is you just simply isolate them in their home cage for a prolonged period of time. So then how do we know whether the mouse is depressed or not? I certainly don't read animals' mind, and for sure I don't read mice' mind. So also I cannot ask them to fill out a questionnaire to tell me, how are you doing today? So how do I know what's the mental stage of a mouse? So luckily in the lab we have behavior tests for the mouse to tell me what's their mental stage. And one of the tasks we use is called social interaction. And what happens is that we have two mice in this chamber, and one is put in here and immobilized in here. And this is our target mice, which is either coming from the group house cage or an isolated cage. So this guy is put in this chamber and allowed to explore freely. And in the normal mouse or healthy mice, they tend to interact with the new mouse. And I forgot to say that this mice is some guy that this guy has never ever met. So normally, a healthy mouse tend to interact with a new object. However, if they are depressed, they tend to hide at the corner and not interact. And we use a video tracking system. When you see these lines, it's actually the movement of this target mouse in here. So under the control condition, you will see this mouse, and we can record the amount of time this mouse spent in this what we call interaction zone. So in a normal mouse, you can see this mouse spent a lot of time in trying to interact with this one that he has never met. But in the isolated mouse, they tend to hide in the corner and not interacting. This is a typical depressive-like behavior of the mouse. And we can actually monitor the time that they spend here and quantify it, and show here that the social isolated mice actually show less interacting time. And this has nothing to do with their mobility. They move fine. The total distance they travel from this is equivalent to their control condition. So this is certainly something that this mouse is something ongoing in the brain of these mice. So what about the myelin? These mice are isolated and they have depressive-like behavior. What happened to their brain? And this is typically what you see in myelin sheaths under the microscope. And what you see here is this inner layer is the axons. And you see this outer layer, which is darker thick. These are the myelins that's wrapping around the axons. And what you see here is in the control condition, these axons are thickly myelinated, but in the isolated condition, you can see a dramatic thinning of the myelin in this mouse brain. And you can actually quantify this by the division, what we call G ratio. But bottom line is what you see here is when you're isolated, you have a depressive-like behavior, the myelination also changes. So this definitely suggests that even in the adult, myelin is also a response to the environment and experience. So what this suggests is that at least at the end of the stage, at the end of the isolation, when you're already depressed, there is a change in the myelination, it's adaptive. That doesn't explain whether the myelination changes is actually causing this depressive-like behavior or it's just the consequence of it. So to answer that, we basically took the same age of mice and we isolate them for a shorter period of time. And in this stage, from the same test, you don't see difference. So basically, they're fine, they're not depressed. And then what happened in their brain? And again, what you see here is that still in the control condition, you have this thickly myelinated axons, but in the isolated condition. And remember, this is at the stage where they don't show depression, and yet you still have a thickening of myelination. This is suggesting that myelination actually may be causal to the depressive-like behavior rather than just being a consequence. And of course, you want to ask, is this change affected by age? Aging is definitely a risk factor that's affecting the efficiency of remyelination. So does aging also play a role in the adaptive response of the brain to myelination? And to make a long story short, I'm just gonna say here that with younger mice, these are like equivalent to the teenager age of mice, let's say. And when you isolate actually for the shorter period of time, they show a difference in the social interaction. And indeed, even when they're young, they are also responsive to the environment, where when you isolate them for a shorter period of time, there is also a thickening of the myelination. So certainly we know that myelin is response to the environment. And the next question is, can we reverse it? So if you think myelin is adaptive response, then if you change the environment after damage has been made, can you change myelination? So the way we change it is, with mouse is rather simple. So you isolate them, and the simple question would be to ask, if you put them back together, does myelination change or does behavior change? And to do that, we simply just took the mouse and we isolate them for a prolonged period of time. And after that, we know at that stage, myelination is changed and they are depressed. And then we put them back together for a month. And then we ask, after this a month, they remingle with each other, what happened to them? And this is what's shown here, is what you see here is in the social interaction, they are basically, after they are regrouped, they basically behave like the control mice. And what about the myelin? And this is a measurement of the myelin genes inside the brain of the same region, where you see this dashed line is where the control behave, and these bars are the regrouped behave. Basically, they are reached or reversed to the line, the same as controls. So to conclude what I have said today, on top of all or behind all the data, if there's one message I want to convey in my talk today is experience does affect myelination. And this is not only occurring in the young age, but also in the adult brain. And it's not only experience, but also the quality of the experience. And with that, I just like to thank people. So this work has been initiated when I was a postdoc in Dr. Patricia Casaja's lab, and now I'm trying to set up my own team and carry on the work I'm doing. And this is where I'm, the medical school where I am, and this is our building, and overlooking the Central Park. So on behalf of me and the lab, I welcome all of you to pay a visit to New York. Thank you.